Yes, I'm very excited to have Jo Haddock on tonight to talk to us about microbats, because I saw her talk maybe 3 years ago, and I was quite excited, and I came away from the talk going, why has nobody told me about microbats before? These are very cool creatures, and I think they're very underreported. So to introduce Jo, she did a Bachelor of Psychology in the UK, specialising in neuroscience, and then did a Masters of Environmental Science and a PhD in bat ecology. And her doctorate specialised on the impact of artificial light pollution on nocturnal biodiversity in cities. And so, yeah, this is where she spent some time in Wolli Creek. And so this is what's so exciting to have her experience and to our much loved patch of bushland near us. So she's now working in community engagement at the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. And she's passionate about relating conservation research to a general audience. And I think she does a great job at it. So take it away, Jo.
Bats are amazingly diverse and often misunderstood creatures. So I've just completed my PhD looking at the effect of artificial lighting in cities on microbats, as Jackie said. I'm excited to present my results to you all. And I'd like to give you a bit of background on the biology of bats. To be honest, I didn't know exactly how much you all knew about bats, and so I wanted to cover some of the basics, maybe a bit of myth busting as well, because there's a lot of myths about bats, particularly around Halloween. There's pitched as very scary creatures. Myself and my spider ecologist friend used to much malign over Halloween. A bit of myth busting. I'll tell you a little bit about how we study them, what my research found, and finally what microbats I've actually recorded in Wolli Creek. I'm presuming you can all hear me, and I can see Sharon's face. So
yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Good sign. Great, good. Awesome, fantastic. So bats. What are they exactly? Well, they're mammals. In fact, they actually make up 25% of all the known mammal species in the world. I'll just say that again, because I'll just let that sink in, because that's a massive fact for me, is that 1 in every 4 mammal species on this planet is a bat species. They're the only mammals capable of true flight. Chiroptera are an amazing group of animals. The morphology, their diet, their behaviour, it's just so complex and amazing. In fact, the word chiroptera actually means hand wing in Latin, which is very biologically accurate. They have basically their wings are just very, very long phalanges or finger bones that are essentially webbed. So they're very much like a long, skinny fingers that they use to fly. So it's not perhaps not as elegant as the bird, but definitely beautiful and very well adapted to what they need it to do. They're the only mammals capable of true and self-sustained flight. Okay, so next slide, please, Jackie. I didn't really know how much you all knew about bats, so I apologise. I'm sure that there's a whole mix of knowledge bases out there, so I thought I'd just myth bust a few things, and I'm sorry if you already know this or if this is going straight up your head and you're not interested in phylogenetic relationships, but this is an overly complicated slide which I will obviously just summarize, hopefully, is that in the phylogenetic tree of life, a lot of people presume, as per, the German word for bat is Fledermaus, which is actually German for flying mouse. A lot of people think that bats are really closely related to rats and mice, but they're actually most closely related to dogs, cows, shrews, and hedgehogs. They diverged a long time ago from the rest of the groups that are still around today, more than 45 million years ago. So they've highly diverged from other living mammals, and that's why they have very different ways of coping with their environment. They're nocturnal, they fly, they Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Oh, good. So bats are most closely related to dogs, cows, shrews, and hedgehogs. And first myth busted is they are not actually very closely related at all to rats. So if you hear anyone say that, please, on my behalf, correct them. So the next slide, and then if you could just go to how did bats evolve, Jackie, that'd be great. The slide, how did bats evolve? Cool. So essentially, bats, as I said, diverged from the rest of the mammalian groups a long, long time ago. Probably some of the earliest divergences along the mammal line, and they've basically developed a lot of advantages. Essentially, why did they evolve? The power of flight. Well, quite possibly it was to avoid terrestrial predators, of which there is many, in Australia, and also to traverse fragmented agricultural. They didn't develop it, but they can now traverse fragmented agricultural or urbanized landscapes to get to food and better roosting habitats. So nocturnality was obviously evolved to avoid predators, but there's a lot of insects out at night, and so they have this amazing access to this fantastic food source that there's very little competition for in actual fact. Next slide, please, Jackie. So when I say to people that I study bats, a lot of people think that it's these guys that I study. So I thought, and obviously I know that Wolli Creek, there's obviously a resident one, and I'm not even sure, and I'd be really interested to hear how the resident camp is going and if it's still there, but I know that it has been, and it was during my PhD resident camp. So megabats, or flying foxes, are fruit bats. They eat, blossom bats, tube-nosed bats, and they eat pollen, nectar, flowers, and fruit. They can get anywhere from 1.5 kilos right up to a, quite honestly, horrifying 15 kilos. They have a great eyesight and a great sense of smell to detect their food. And the question I get asked the most is, are these bats blind? Do they use echolocation? This is the biggest standard of difference between the flying foxes, the megabats, and the microbats that I'm going to talk about in a minute, is that these megabats don't use echolocation. So they have amazing sight. You can see by their gorgeous little puppy kind of faces, these big eyes. They have better sight than us during the day and at night. So they're pretty impressive animals. Next slide, please, Jackie. But these are the guys that I studied during my PhD, and I quite think they're amazing, really. I think they're absolutely fascinating. I just chose some of these pictures. These are some pictures I've taken, some pictures my colleagues have taken. All of these bats are from Australia. And I just selected all these pictures and put them alongside each other just to show you the massive morphological range there is, even in one country. They all look so different. Because, quite often, or quite rarely, people actually ever get to see these animals up close. And so they kind of think they must be this kind of homogeneous brown, they all look the same, but they don't. They really don't. They really are quite amazing to look at. Next slide, please, Jackie. So the bats that I study are microbats. There are about 70 species of microbats in Australia. Unfortunately, in 2008, one of the last mammal species to go extinct in Australia, fully extinct and has been confirmed as extinct, was the Christmas Island pipistrelle. In 2008, we recorded the last echolocation call of that species ever, which is very sad.
These animals are honestly amazing. We have ghost bats, sheath-tailed bats, leaf-nosed bats, horseshoe bats, free-tailed bats, bent-wing bats, long-eared bats, forest bats, and it goes on and on and on. They range from anywhere between 4 grams fully grown to 170 grams fully grown. They use echolocation to navigate and hunt, and I will go more into echolocation in a minute. But the majority of them are insectivores, but I love telling people this because, well, it's kind of a bit gruesome, and, you know, nature can be pretty gruesome and amazing. So quite a lot of them specialize in insects, but a lot of them will happily eat frogs, lizards. We have a fishing bat in Australia that can detect the 1 millimeter of a minnow's fin above the water from about 5 meters away with their echolocation. So it's incredibly powerful navigation and hunting tool. The larger microbats can eat rats. They can eat other bats. I've had reports, not myself, but I've had reports of bats eating other bats in bat traps. And of course, some microbats will eat blood or do feed on the blood of their prey, I guess, but not in Australia. So we can all kind of sleep a little bit happier, perhaps. Next slide, please, Jackie. So these are just more pictures of amazing bats. These are all, again, Australian species. And I will touch on the bottom right bat, the Gould's wattle bat, is actually one that I have detected in Wolli Creek before. So I'll explain to you a little bit more about him in a minute. But I just thought I would show you the amazing variety of morphologies in the bat world. Next slide, please, Jackie. Hopefully you should be on Microbats behaviour slide. So they live in look, it's so hard to talk about, you know, we've got 16 different species of microbat across the Sydney Basin, the Sydney Basin alone. And then as soon as you go a little bit further out, even to the Hunter Valley, you can add another 10 on that. So they're incredibly diverse with lots of different species, even just in Sydney, and they live across the world. They can live in a range of habitats, so it's hard to really talk about them as a homogeneous group. They live in forests, tropics, islands, cities. There's even a couple of years ago they discovered a species that actually hibernates in the snow in winter, just buries down into the snow and hibernates. They give birth to live young and they lactate like us, and they have variable sized colonies. So this is a question I often get asked, and it hugely varies from the time of the season, to the species. So some species will never form maternity colonies, some always do. Some species, the males switches roost every couple of days, and they have their like 3 kind of favorite like bachelor pad tree hangouts, and then there's some species that will form, like you could see there is a fairly large roost on the Central Coast, but you can see in Texas there's, you know, over, they think, 4 million of these bats, individual bats, roosting under a bridge in Texas, and they fly out every night, and that's a massive amount of bats to be living in one place, but it's obviously advantageous for them in some way. Next slide, please, Jackie. So hopefully you can see my slide about the eastern bentwing bat. So I thought I would, because there's obviously so much going on in terms of the species I could talk to you about, I thought I would pick one particularly interesting one. I have recorded an eastern bentwing bat in Wolli Creek, so I thought I'd pick this one out and talk to you about this one. This is the bentwing bat, eastern bentwing. It's called that because it's got a slight but very cute kink in its ulna, so just the bone that leads out to the main structure of the wing, sorry. And essentially, up until very recently, we kind of didn't know what they did. So spring and summer, Sydney's population, we could detect them, you know, flying around. And then they kind of just disappeared. And they were forming we discovered these huge maternity colonies out in regional New South Wales. So think about, places like Orange, Bathurst, right down to Yass. They would span out and find all these amazing cave systems to go and make all these beautiful maternity colonies, have all their babies, and then we would be detecting that they would be coming back to Sydney in kind of autumn, winter, around kind of March, April. You start picking up eastern bent-winged bats again. And so it's kind of amazing that this huge exodus is happening above our heads every night. We have no idea what's, and until very recently, because they are so cryptic and they are hard to study, that we really, we still don't have a good handle on how many there are of this species, where exactly they go to, and in what numbers. And there's many maternity colonies that we still don't know about. So very interesting species. Next slide, please, Jackie. I was debating whether to delete this slide, but it is actually one of my favorite, and I thought it's such an interesting piece of information, and I apologize, there's probably some people in the room that definitely know this, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about it so that I could contextualize later the species that I have detected in Wolli Creek. So as I mentioned, all microbats are capable of echolocation. So what is echolocation? So the bats will make little clicks with their throat, and they send those clicks out into the atmosphere, and then they listen to those echoes come back. And the sound will bounce off something like a tree that they want to avoid flying into, or the echoes will bounce off a little moth flying through the air. And then when those echoes return to the bat actually uses those echoes to put together an amazingly detailed picture of their surroundings and their potential prey. Now, the super interesting thing, and the bit that I spent a lot of time in my PhD looking at, was the fact that, there's all these bats out there. There's lots above our heads every night. They all eat insects, as we've talked about. So how do they actually share the same food resource? How do they kind of petition the different areas off? Is there any specific species that go to certain habitats? Well, essentially, yes, there is. So bats that live in different habitats make different sounds. Now, the diagram I have here it kind of looks a bit like a mushroom, someone has once told me, but it's actually adapted from a paper that was published in 2013 that looked at the different general habitats that microbats will hunt in. So I want to take you back to high school physics for a minute. Low sounds travel further and bounce back off objects before they attenuate in the atmosphere. So if you make a low sound, it's more likely to travel further away and bounce back accurately than a really high-pitched sound that you will make, and then it will attenuate before it's able to bounce back. Essentially, there's these three different habitats that bats like to exist in. We have clutter-adapted bats, and these bats, using kind of logic, I hope you're kind of following me along here, is that these cluttered bats create their echolocation calls are incredibly high frequency, sometimes up to 180 kilohertz. Now, we can only hear to about 20 kilohertz, but they can call sometimes up to 180 kilohertz. And that means that they have this really high definition picture of their environment. They don't have to worry about the sound kind of going far away and attenuating and them not getting the echo. They get it all back. They get this really high definition picture, all of the trees they can avoid, all of the little insects they can glean off leaves. Then we have the edge adapted bats. Now, these guys kind of duck into the forest and then they go out into open space. And as a result, they actually have quite variable echolocation calls. And then we have the open space bats. Now, these guys are evolved to fly really, really high over bushland. And I hope your logic prevails, and you understand that these guys make much lower frequency echolocation calls because they need that sound to travel much further before it hits an object and comes back to them, because they're up in open space. So that everything's a little bit more spread out. In fact, there is a species called Astronomus australis, or the white-striped free-tailed bat, which I will show you a picture of in a minute. And they are an open space adapted bat, and they actually echolocate at about 18 kilohertz mainly, which means that on a very quiet night, and if you have exceptionally good hearing, you can actually hear them echolocate above your head. And I always hear some flying above my house at night here, and it always makes me smile, because you can always just think about this little guy flying around above your head, completely invisible to human eyes and predators. Next slide, please, Jackie. So I wanted to give you all that information because it's really important, and apologies again if everyone's heard this before, but it's really important to understand that those different species have different echolocation call types, because one of the ways we study them is we put bat detectors out and we can record their echolocation calls, so we can be fairly confident, depending on what the call frequency is, what that actual species was flying above our heads. And in fact, sometimes we can even pinpoint, so the calls will kind of speed up sometimes in some species when they're honing in on prey, which is super cool when you think about it. You can actually hear them kind of going, and we call that like a feeding buzz, because they're trying to catch something in midair. So we can, not only can we tell by the sound what species it is, but we can also sometimes tell what they're doing, whether they're feeding or not. This lower left photo is also a photo of a VHF radio transmitter, which we can sometimes also stick to the back of little bats and actually track where they go. So whereas the bat detectors, their echolocation call recorders give us information on what is flying above our head, sometimes we want information on where individual bats go. And they've done a lot of radio tracking for species like the bent-winged bat that I talked about earlier, where they move out of Sydney and go to regional New South Wales. And we can tell a lot about a species by an individual's behaviour. Next slide, please, Jackie. I'm going to skip over this slide because of the horrendous technical difficulties we're having tonight, but I encourage you, I hope that you get a chance to click on this link in your own time. It's only 10 seconds, and it's a recording of a bat actually eliciting a feeding buzz to try and catch his moth, and that's magical to me, music to my ears. So I'd encourage you to listen to it, and then probably go down a YouTube hole of lots of amazing bat videos, I hope. Next slide, please, Jackie. So probably, fortunately, I don't know, fortunately you can't see my face tonight, but this is what I look like. And in 2019, I finished my PhD in urban ecology, the study of plants and animals in or near cities. Next slide, please, Jackie. So hopefully you should be seeing a picture of some lights and cars and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So there are many threats to urban wildlife, more in cities than you think. But cities are also home to the most threatened species per square mile than in non-urban areas. So I'll just say that again, because I think a lot of people think that cities are just full of rats and pigeons, but thankfully they are not. And they're actually home to the most threatened species per square mile above non-urban areas, which is fantastic, which means that we have to do some real management in order to help them persist. So lighting and noise are some of those threats. And urbanization in general means that cities are now more of a patchwork of small islands of bushland surrounded by highly altered environments, like roads and houses. And Wolli Creek is a perfect example, one of the kind of the last tiny, the last of the patches of that patchwork in inner city Sydney. And the further up, and south you get more of this patchwork of bushland. But Wolli Creek is so important for the bats that are existing in that area, because they really need roosting habitat, they really need drinking, access to drinking water, and they need a good vegetation community that supports good insect meals. So next slide, please, Jackie. So my PhD focused on light pollution. It's been identified as a major global biodiversity threat. And I'd like to take you really quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, but I want to take you really quickly through my PhD findings. So next slide, please, Jackie. So I wanted to just say that, first of all, that light is not light. We've got lots of different types of light. And it goes from everything from narrow spectrum, right at the bottom right, with the red LEDs, which is just a very sharp spike in the red part of the spectrum, all the way up to daylight, which is broad spectrum. It's high in all different colors of wavelengths. And I discovered that this is actually a huge thing to consider when I was going into light pollution research, was because actually these lights aren't all the same. Particularly, I mean, they look different to us, but they're particularly different to a lot of nocturnal fauna. And so it was worth considering this when it wasn't just, oh, that's a light area and that's a dark area. There was a lot more nuance than that. Next slide, please, Jackie. So I set up an experiment. Essentially, Sydney's lights are changing because Sydney want to save money. They want to switch to greener energy, greener lights, energy efficient lights. So they're switching a lot of lights to LED lights. But I was interested to know what impact that was actually having on the bat population of Sydney. So the first, number one, is a light. I had a couple of different sites within each of the four conditions. But number one was a mercury vapor type light, which, and you can see the spectrum here, is quite high in the green part of the spectrum. There's a bit of a spike around the green area of the spectrum, and that's actually tends to be what part of the spectrum a lot of nocturnal fauna really hate. Then the second is an LED light. The third condition was mercury vapor changing to LED street lights. And then the fourth condition was just bushland near those street lights as a bit of a control, so that I knew what bats were around, but I could tell which bats were choosing not to go anywhere near the street lights. Next slide, please, Jackie. This is what I found. Essentially, mercury vapor, the older street lights, were actually pretty, they supported a few different species. So there's lots of reasons why some bat species would navigate towards streetlights, because there's lots of insects there, right? Because light attracts a lot of insects. So mercury vapor was obviously attracting lots of insects, and some bat species were coming in to feed on them. I found that the newer LED lights elsewhere in Sydney, bats hated them. Something about them bats really did not like, and we still don't quite know what that is, honestly. My third condition of the lights changing from mercury vapor to LEDs halfway through my experiment, I found the kind of same pattern. So they were there, these bats were there when mercury vapor lights were on. As soon as they changed to the LED lights, the bats disappeared. I feel like the most important finding of this study, to be honest, was the fact that this bushland, this dark bushland that I sampled, bats of all types loved it. So the clutter adapted bats, the ones that we talked about earlier, having that really high frequency echolocation call, They weren't found anywhere else but this dark urban bushland, much like Wolli Creek. So it's incredibly important to retain those patches of bushland, dark urban bushland in the landscape, because otherwise we'll just completely lose those clutter-adapted bats from our cities. But also, I found that even the edge-adapted and open air adapted bats also loved that dark urban bushland. So you were getting like a whole range of different bats in there. Next slide, please, Jackie. I'm just going to skim through the next couple of things because I know I'm going over time, but another of my studies actually compared the impact of different coloured lights on the bat assemblage out in Menangle in Western Sydney, and I found that cool white LED streetlights are just horrendous and abhorrent to almost all microbat species. It must be the way that their eyes work. They do have sight, and so they are put off by that light in the same way as they don't want to come out during the day. There's something about that light that kind of it really puts them off. Whereas I put up red light over wetlands, and a lot of the bat species didn't actually seem that bothered, which has huge implications. There's actually whole villages, and I would encourage you to go look it up afterwards, but there's whole villages in the Netherlands that are putting up red light streetlights to help protect their nocturnal fauna, and they're seeing huge influxes of nocturnal fauna back into their villages, which is amazing, really. Next slide, please, Jackie. So hopefully you should be seeing a slide with a car driving under lots of streetlights and a red streetlights and a bit of text. So I guess the take-home messages from my research are that we have to really investigate different ways to conserve dark areas of bushland, but we also have to look at ways we can use lighting technology to the advantage of, or at least minimize the impact on nocturnal fauna. So part night lighting, for example, or motion censored lighting, or red lights instead of white lights, as the Netherlands is doing at the moment. Next slide, Jackie, please. So the exciting bit, I think, because it's so much more personal and interesting, and I really hope that that you can find these bats when you go out and survey next time. But the bats that I detected in Wolli Creek with my bat detectors are the Gould's wattled bat. So next slide, please, Jackie. This is the most gorgeous photo I know that exists of a bat. He's just got this big grin. This is the Gould's wattled bat. And basically, he or she, they are an edge-adapted bat. So where I was talking before, they were quite, that bat kind of ducks in and out of forests and then out into the open. We think that this has actually meant that these bats are much better equipped to deal with urbanization because they can change their echolocation, they can change their flight strategy. So this guy's doing amazingly in Sydney, not in any way. We don't think he's been impacted at all. In fact, I've actually recorded a Gould's wattled bat basically flying above King Street in Newtown, which is where I used to live. So they seem to be doing well in urban areas. Next slide, please, Jackie. The next two species I recorded in Wolli Creek were the white-striped three-tailed bat and the eastern three-tailed bat. Now, these two are the open these two are the open adapted bats. So these guys fly really high in the sky. The Astronomus australis, the white-striped three-tailed bat, is the one I said that you could probably hear with without any bat detector. You can sometimes hear them echolocate. An eastern three-tailed bat also flies really high in the sky. They have really low echolocation calls. Next slide, please, Jackie. And I thought I'd just put a nice cute picture of them in. They're much bigger than the other bats. They're not 4-gram little ones. There you can see on that person's hand. They are gorgeous bats, very hard to catch because they fly really, really high above, particularly above cities, to get to their patches of woodland that they will feed and roost in. But gorgeous all the same, I think anyway. Next slide, please, Jackie. Second to last, we have the eastern bent-winged bat, which is the bat that I told you goes out to regional New South Wales to form maternity colonies. When they come back to Sydney, some of them come back to Wolli Creek and they roost in Wolli Creek. At least we think they roost in Wolli Creek. At least they forage in Wolli Creek. So that's really cool to think that those bats are flying out of Sydney every year and they're choosing to come back to Wolli Creek. So you guys must be doing something right because it's obviously good habitat for these bats. Next slide, please, Jackie. And finally, the last two I wanted to mention were the little forest bat and Gould's long-eared bat. Now, these two, loosely speaking, are more clutter-adapted bats, those guys that exist right in the clutter of vegetation, and they hardly ever really come out. They have very small home ranges, and both of these species were detected in Wolli Creek, and the chances of them really leaving Wolli Creek are pretty small because they would need some very dense habitat and connected habitat to get from patch to patch. They're not likely to fly up and over houses. So those two were also detected in Wolli Creek. And the next slide, please, Jackie, is a picture of a little baby, a baby little forest bat, the teeny tiniest of animals, really. The little forest bat, Vespidellus alternus, grows to only about 4 grams fully grown. A fully grown male will be 4 grams, which is about the same weight as a $2 coin. So really tiny. And of course, I would love to hear, I put this slide in because I've been very remiss and not talked about flying foxes in Wolli Creek at all, and I'm very aware that you have a camp or at least had a camp. So I'm really interested to hear from you what is going on with your flying foxes now. And next slide, please, Jackie. This is just a cute picture of the bat again, and I really appreciate you listening to my talk, a weird voice on the end of a phone. So thank you very much.